Everyone wants to be understood. That's the most basic human desire there is. You want people to get you, to laugh with you, to feel what you feel. Now imagine trying to build that connection when words, the most basic tool humans use to communicate, regularly betray you. Rowan Atkinson had a stammer, a real one, the kind that makes interviews uncomfortable, public speaking a nightmare, and a career in performance seem like the worst possible idea. And yet, he created a character so universally understood that it has been watched billions of times across every continent, in every language, by people who have never heard of British television, who don't speak English, who live in countries where most Western comedy dies on arrival. The character didn't need words. That wasn't an accident. Now, this is how Rowan Atkinson built the most universal comedy character in history, and why the strategy behind it was smarter than almost anyone gives him credit for. Here's something most people never think about. Comedy is one of the hardest things to export. Music travels, emotion travels, action movies travel. A car chase looks the same in Tokyo as it does in Texas. But comedy is fragile. It depends on shared references, cultural context, wordplay, timing that feels native. A joke that kills in Manchester lands flat in Mumbai. A sitcom beloved in America is confusing in rural France. This is why most comedians, even brilliant ones, stay regional. They dominate their home market, and that's it. Their ceiling is defined by the language their audience speaks. British comedy in particular has always struggled with this. Yes, there are exceptions, but the default assumption in the industry was simple. British comedy is for British people. Rowan Atkinson understood this problem before he solved it. Before Mr. Bean, Atkinson wasn't a nobody. He had Blackadder, one of the most acclaimed British comedies ever made. Sharp, verbal, historically layered, brilliantly written. Critics loved it. Awards followed it. A generation of British comedy writers studied it. But Blackadder was deeply, almost aggressively British. It ran on wordplay, historical in-jokes, and a particular kind of dry sarcasm that required cultural fluency to fully appreciate. It was brilliant, and it had a ceiling. Atkinson knew that. He also knew something about himself, something he'd lived with his entire life. Words were not his most reliable tool, and he had studied electrical engineering at Oxford, not drama, not performance. He understood systems. He understood how things worked at a structural level. And when he approached comedy, he approached it the same way, not intuitively, analytically. He had written academic work on control systems. He thought about feedback loops, about inputs and outputs, about what causes what. Apply that thinking to comedy, and you start asking a different question. Not, what's funny to British people, but what's funny to humans. Here's where the strategy starts. Atkinson identified something that most comedians never consciously articulate. Physical comedy is pre-linguistic. Before humans had language, they had faces, they had bodies. They communicated through gesture, expression, movement. That wiring is still there, deep in the brain, below the layer where language lives. When you see a face contort in confusion, you don't need to speak English to understand it. When a body does something unexpected and slightly wrong, the laugh response is automatic. Chaplin knew this. Keaton knew this. Tati knew this. But by the 1980s and 90s, physical comedy was considered old-fashioned. Television had moved toward dialogue. Sitcoms were verbal. The prestige format was the witty, fast-talking ensemble. Atkinson decided to go the other direction, not because physical comedy was trendy, because it was universal, and universal meant no ceiling. The character of Mr. Bean was not thrown together. Atkinson has talked about developing the physical language of Bean deliberately, the facial expressions, the walk, the particular way Bean holds his body, slightly rigid, slightly suspicious of the world around him. Bean is childlike, not stupid, childlike. There's a difference. A child approaches the world without the social scripts adults use. A child sits in a church pew and finds it genuinely strange that everyone is expected to behave a certain way. A child on an exam doesn't reach for the expected solution. They reach for whatever solution makes sense to them in that moment. That's Bean, an adult body running children's social software. And here's why that's universally funny. Every human alive was once a child. Every human alive has sat in situations where the social rules felt arbitrary and confusing and had to suppress the urge to behave like Bean does. Bean doesn't suppress it. He is the part of all of us that looks at adult social life and finds it slightly absurd. You don't need to speak English to feel that. You just need to have been alive. Now, here's the part most people miss entirely. Making Bean largely silent was not a limitation. It was a calculated removal of the ceiling. Think about what silence does strategically. The moment a character speaks, you've made a choice. You've chosen a language. You've chosen an accent. You've chosen a cultural register. You've immediately told a portion of your potential audience, this is for someone else. By making Bean operate almost entirely without dialogue, Atkinson made a decision that looked like a creative quirk, but was actually a distribution strategy. No dubbing required, no subtitles needed, no cultural translator necessary. The product shipped globally in its original form, without modification, without loss of quality, without anything getting lost in translation, because there was nothing to translate. Let's talk about what that decision produced. Mr. Bean first aired in 1990. There were only 14 episodes. 14. A number so small it seems almost impossible given what followed. Those 14 episodes have been broadcast in over 200 countries. The Mr. Bean YouTube channel accumulated over 6.5 billion views, not total channel views across hundreds of videos. Views built largely on a small library of content that is now decades old. The Facebook page reached 94 million followers. At the time, that was more than Rihanna, more than Manchester United, more than Harry Potter. 14 episodes, billions of views. The ratio of content created to audience reached is almost absurd. Most creators spend their lives trying to manufacture virality. Atkinson created something structurally viral before the internet existed to carry it. When the internet arrived, it simply found the content waiting. Here's something interesting about universal content. It doesn't age the same way language-dependent content ages. A British sitcom from 1990 feels dated to modern British audiences because the references, the slang, the cultural context has shifted. You're watching a document of a specific time and place. Mr. Bean doesn't have that problem. There are no references to date it, no slang to decode, no cultural context required. A 12-year-old watching it in Brazil in 2024 has the same experience as a British adult watching it in 1992. The content is essentially evergreen, and evergreen content on the internet doesn't decay, it compounds. Every year, Yeah, a new generation of children encounters Bean for the first time. Every year, parents show it to kids. Every year, the algorithm surfaces it to someone who never saw it. The asset keeps appreciating. Most media depreciates. Bean appreciates. Remember, this is a man with a master's degree in electrical engineering from Oxford. When Atkinson talks about comedy, he doesn't talk about it the way most performers do. He talks about the mechanics, the geometry of a funny face, the precise timing of a physical gag, the structural logic of why something lands. He once described comedy as being partly about the configuration of the face, that certain facial structures are inherently funnier than others, and that understanding that allows you to design performance rather than just perform instinctively, design rather than instinct. That's an engineer's framing, and it shows in Bean. The character is almost architecturally constructed. Every physical choice is deliberate. The expressions are extreme but controlled. The physical gags are precisely choreographed to hit at exactly the right moment. It doesn't feel mechanical because the engineering is invisible, but it's there. The difference between Bean and lesser physical comedy is the difference between a well-engineered product and something thrown together and hoping for the best. One of them lasts. Now let's come back to where we started. Rowan Atkinson has a stammer. It has affected him his whole life. He has said in interviews, the few he gives because he dislikes them, that it makes normal conversation difficult, that it creates a particular kind of anxiety around speech. Here's the paradox. The thing that made words unreliable for him became the insight that made him globally powerful. Because he couldn't fully trust words, he understood viscerally, not theoretically, that words were not the only tool, that the body communicates, that the face communicates, that timing communicates. Most performers grow up comfortable with language and never seriously interrogate whether there might be a more powerful medium. They default to words because words work well enough. Atkinson couldn't default to words, so he went deeper. And what he found at the bottom of that, the pre-linguistic, physical, universal comedy that humans respond to before they think about it, turned out to be far more powerful than anything language-dependent could have reached. The limitation became the lever. Here's the part of this story that almost nobody frames correctly. People look at Mr. Bean and see a silly character, a childlike man doing clumsy things, light entertainment, harmless fun. They don't see the distribution strategy. They don't see the deliberate removal of language as a global unlock. They don't see the engineering mind that constructed each expression and each gag with mechanical precision. They don't see that 14 episodes, 14 created an asset that has generated billions of views across 30 years and is still growing. They don't see the stammer behind the silence. Most people, when they face a limitation, try to overcome it, work around it, or hide it. Atkinson did something different. He built his entire, most powerful creation around it. He made the limitation the feature. It's worth spending a moment on Blackadder because the contrast is instructive. Blackadder is arguably more sophisticated. The writing is sharper. The historical satire is more layered. The verbal performances are extraordinary. And Blackadder has a ceiling. It is beloved in Britain. It has a passionate international cult following among people who specifically seek out British comedy. But it does not have 94 million Facebook followers. It does not have billions of YouTube views because Blackadder requires something from its audience. It requires cultural context. language fluency, a certain familiarity with British history and humor. Being requires nothing. Show up, watch, laugh. That's the entire barrier to entry. Low barrier to entry times, large global population equals audience size that language-dependent content structurally cannot reach. Atkinson made both. He understood the difference between them. The question is whether you make the thing that's impressive or the thing that's universal. Sometimes they're the same thing. More often they're not. Here's why this matters beyond one comedian and one character. The internet has created a global distribution system that rewards universal content at a scale that was previously impossible. Before the internet, Bean was successful but limited by how many countries licensed it, how many channels aired it, how often it reran. The internet removed all of those limits. Suddenly, universal content doesn't just travel, it compounds algorithmically, endlessly, across platforms, across languages, across generations. Mr. Beast, no relation to Mr. Bean, though the overlap is interesting, has built his entire operation around the same insight: high concept, visual content that doesn't depend on linguistic nuance, challenges and spectacle that translate without explanation. He didn't consciously copy Atkinson, but he arrived at the same structural conclusion. Universal content has no ceiling. The internet rewards no ceiling. Here's what actually happened. Rowan Atkinson had a stammer. Words were unreliable, so he went deeper than words. He identified physical comedy as pre-linguistic, something humans respond to before language processes it. He built a character with no language dependency whatsoever. He designed rather than improvised, engineering the expressions, timing, and physical gags with mechanical precision. And he made the character universal, childlike logic that every human recognizes because every human was once a child. He created 14 episodes. Those 14 episodes reached 200 countries, 6.5 billion YouTube views, and 94 million Facebook followers. The content is evergreen. No slang, no references, no cultural context required, no expiry date. The limitation, the stammer, became the insight. The insight became the strategy. The strategy became the most watched comedy character in history. Most people try to build around their weaknesses. Atkinson built with his. The thing that made conventional performance harder for him forced him to find something more powerful than conventional performance. That's not a motivational lesson. That's just what happened. If the result is a character that has been laughed at by more humans than almost any other piece of comedy content ever created. 14 episodes, no words, no ceiling. If you like breakdowns of the real strategies behind the things that actually succeeded, subscribe because there are a lot more of them.